If you have been participating in Spirit of God Fellowship's Bible reading program that we've all been doing together, early on we went through one of my favorite Old Testament books, Habakkuk. Reading through it again brought me back to the many times I'd been drawn to it, and I've studied it, particularly when I was going through tough times. Indeed, despite its short length, Habakkuk turns out to be a primer for how to handle difficult times. And if we dive in chapter 1, we have Habakkuk complaining to God. Starting in verse 2, it says, "How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted." Habakkuk is accusing God of being unfair, allowing corruption and immorality. The poor are oppressed. Justice is perverted. Nobody seems to care about doing what's right. Everyone is just living for themselves. And the most frustrating thing for him is that God appears to not care. But then God responds. He reveals he's going to send judgment on the people through the Babylonians. They're going to come and destroy the nation. If Habakkuk thought things were bad, they're about to get a whole lot worse. Habakkuk then cries out to God a second time, but now he's even more confused. He's more upset. This is really not fair. And at the end of chapter 1 in verse 16, Habakkuk seems to be without hope. He asks whether Babylon will be allowed to destroy nations without mercy. But as chapter 2 begins, Habakkuk waits to hear from God. And this time he says, "I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint." Then the Lord replied, "Write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. See, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness." Instead of continuing his earlier tantrums, Habakkuk hits the pause button. And he waits. And this whole story shows us a principle that will serve to equip us in difficult times, and it's the concept of waiting on the Lord. And it's almost a cliche that we hear Christians talk about all the time. You need to wait on the Lord. Me, I'm just waiting on the Lord. But does anybody really know what that means? It sounds really spiritual, but do we really understand? How do you actually wait on the Lord? Well, this passage helps lay it out for us, and tucked away in these first 4 verses of chapter 2 are 5 aspects, 5 conceptual ways to wait on the Lord. Chapter 2 teaches us that, number 1, we need to wait on the Lord with patience. We need to wait with the proper perspective. We need to wait in obedience. We need to focus on God while we wait. And we need to wait with joy. Now, first off, we must wait patiently. If you look at verse 3 again, it says, "The revelation awaits an appointed time. Though it linger, wait for it." Habakkuk, of course, he's confused. He's searching for answers. God has promised him revelation, but he warns that it will take time. God says, wait for it, and the word wait here is literally the Hebrew word for patient. And to be honest, I hate waiting. I once left a full cart of groceries and walked out of the store when a cashier couldn't figure out how to accept my check. If I'm on hold on the phone with customer service, you wait and you wait and you wait, and all you hear is that annoying recording that says, "Your call is very important to us." So I get so frustrated, I just hang up. But that's not patience. God is calling me and calling all of us to learn what it means to not give up, to not despair or get agitated or freak out, but be patient. It turns out that the most basic thing about waiting on the Lord means that when everything makes no sense, when you're up to your armpits in the worst kinds of difficulties, instead of giving up or blowing up, God wants me to be patient. Waiting on the Lord means I need to be patient in my difficult circumstances. And the Bible shows us that patience grows out of at least two deliberate actions or choices that we must make. First, patience comes as a deliberate act of humility. In James chapter 4, starting in verse 13, it says, "Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow, we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that." So I make my plans. I chart out what I'm going to do today. I think I know how my life ought to work. But James 4:14 says, I don't know what will happen in the future. I think I know what's best, and I schedule or plan accordingly, but the reality is, I don't know. James suggests that instead I should say, well, if it's the Lord's will. Well, what does that mean? When things go wrong, I react. You can ask my wife, you can ask any of my children, holy cow, do I react. I react angrily, I'm in despair, I give into worry, I give into fear, and I believe that I can't help it. Sinking into all of these feelings and emotions, it's just part of who I am, right? Well, these feelings come out of what Tim Keller defines as an assumption about my own omniscience. You know what that means, right? Omniscience? It's the state of knowing everything, a quality that only God possesses. When my plans or expectations don't come to fruition, I react. This is a disaster. I convince myself that a certain something must happen for my life to have meaning. And God just looks down at me and scoffs. Oh, so you know, do you? But I can't really know. I'm upset, but for what? When I am freaking out because something that I want to happen doesn't happen, what's happening is I am climbing onto God's throne. I think that I know better than God. But in reality, as James says, I don't know. So I need to humbly repent of this assumed omniscience of thinking I know better than God. In order to be patient, I must purpose to be humble. The second way that patience comes is when we deliberately decide to let circumstances contribute to our personal growth. I have to admit, I do not do this. When something bad is happening, when I suffer a deep disappointment, I do not say to God, thank you for this wonderful opportunity to become more like the person you created me to be. In fact, that is never my reaction, at least not at first. But the Bible is clear. When we deliberately meet disappointment or calamity with patience, it will transform us. It will turn us into something more pleasing to God. For example, let's look at James 1, starting in chapter 2. My brothers and sisters, when you have many kinds of troubles, you should be full of joy, because you know that these troubles test your faith, and this will give you patience. Let your patience show itself perfectly in what you do. Then you will be perfect and complete and will have everything you need. Or let's look at Romans chapter 5, starting in verse 3. We also have joy with our troubles because we know that these troubles produce patience. And patience produces character, and character produces hope. And this hope will never disappoint us because God has poured out his love to fill our hearts. When bad things happen, if we meet it with patience, it turns us into a person of character, a person with spiritual poise, or not. It's our choice. It's been said that pressure will turn a lump of coal into a diamond. So that's waiting with patience. Second, we must learn to wait on the Lord with the proper perspective. If we look at chapter 2, verse 1, Habakkuk is waiting to hear from God, and he declares that I station myself on the ramparts. A rampart is a fortified tower. Why did the cities in Habakkuk's time build towers? Well, they wanted to see what was coming. At ground level, the things that approach the city can't be seen until they're right at the gate. But up high in the tower, you can see things coming from far off. From the tower, you can see bad weather coming, or dignitaries approaching, or enemies on the march. When the alarm sounds that the city is under attack, it's easy to give in to despair. It looks like everything's lost. But the guard in the tower can see that on the horizon, there are reinforcements coming that will overcome the enemy, and the anxiety attack ceases because we have the proper perspective. Everything is going to be all right. Waiting for the Lord in the tower means that we put our problems into the context of this larger perspective. Paul gives us an example of going into the tower in Romans 8:18. He says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. Now that word consider is a technical accounting term. It implies that a complete audit of the situation has been made, and Paul's added it all up and concluded that what we suffer through today can't compare to the glory that will be revealed in us in the future. Now, Paul himself, he had a lot of suffering. He was persecuted. They tried to stone him to death. He was shipwrecked. He was bit by a snake. He had a myriad of all kinds of other health problems, but he puts it into perspective. Now, my sufferings can seem awfully big, but when I go up into the tower, I get the big picture. I see things from God's perspective. My suffering can seem very small. Paul is meditating upon the glory that is coming until it infuses him and penetrates him, which makes suffering now seem bearable. Waiting on the Lord is to actively choose to go up into the tower and find the right perspective. Now, third, we need to wait on the Lord obediently. This is also revealed in the tower. Our role in the tower is more than just an observer. Chapter 2, verse 1 says, I will stand at my watch. This word watch is a military term. Waiting for the Lord is akin to being on guard duty. I've never served in the military, but I do know this. It doesn't matter if a soldier feels bad, is bored, sleepy, having a bad day, they cannot leave their post. If they do, the whole city could be lost. A soldier has to do his duty. Habakkuk shows us that even though he's struggling with God in a big way, nothing makes sense. What God is doing doesn't make any sense. He actively chooses to not leave his post. Now, I face the same choice. I may be tired. I may suffer disappointment. I may think God is absent, but I can't leave my post. I don't get a vacation for morality or sensibility. I have to keep on obeying God. Even in plain English, waiting doesn't mean sitting around. The servers in restaurants are called waiters and waitresses, and they certainly don't just sit around. In fact, the good ones are constantly on the move, and that's because waiting also means to serve. So one of the things waiting on the Lord means is even when we're getting nothing out of it and we don't feel like doing it, we still do our duty. Here's what usually happens, though. When God's absent or we're experiencing difficult times, we withdraw into ourselves. It's an introverted sort of rebellion. We stop participating in the kingdom. We stop worshiping and praying and reading the Bible, fellowshipping. We stop serving others. And why? Well, we're filled with self-pity. We feel bad, and we're just not getting anything out of it, are we? Now, the other side of that is, of course, extroverted rebellion, where we willfully and often aggressively do things we know we shouldn't do. When we're deep in disappointment, we're beat up, we're feeling empty, sometimes we just want to feel better. And that's the time when many of us turn to things like drugs and alcohol and sex and money and food, shopping, binge watching Netflix. We might feel better for a while, but ultimately we're going to feel worse. That's another way we shirk our duty and we leave our post. Waiting on the Lord means we just can't leave our post. And thankfully, God's grace allows me to retake my post after I've failed. The fourth concept for waiting on the Lord is to focus on God while we wait. It's God-centered waiting. That is to make our personal relationship with God the central concept. In short, this means we wait on the Lord himself and not on what the Lord can give to us or do for us. The book of Habakkuk is often compared with the book of Job. Oh, it's a good thing we're not looking at the book of Job today. The themes are very much the same. At the start of Job's story, we have Satan confronting God about Job. He points out all the many blessings God has given to Job, his family, his wealth, his social prominence, and Satan argues Job's devotion to God is based on those blessings and not on God. And so if he were to lose them all, Job would curse God. Now, the thing is, Satan was basically right, at least about human nature. We all begin our connection with God because we're looking to get something. We're seeking God because we're unhappy or we feel guilty, and we want God to fix that. As a starting point, that's okay, but we can't stay there. The reason why we can't stay there is that kind of mindset is absolute hypocrisy. It's like, say, a woman marries a wealthy guy. The benefits from her marriage are beyond her wildest dreams. Then something happens to her husband, the source of his wealth is cut off, no more money, so she walks away. She divorces him, she drops him like a hot potato. Now the husband feels betrayed. His wife never really loved him, just the benefits she received from him. That is scandalous. That is awful, but it's true. We often run into people who will say, well, I grew up a Christian and I went to church and I prayed for things for years and years, but God never gave me anything, so I'm done with that. Now, if a friend treated them the same way, they'd be furious, and they'd have a right to be furious. Waiting on the Lord means to love him for who he is in and of himself. And that means staying faithful to him even when you're getting nothing out of it at all. It's the only way our self-centered nature changes into real love, when loving God gives me no benefit at all. At the end of the story, whether it's here in Habakkuk or in Job or in many of the Psalms, we see angry, frustrated people struggling and wrestling with God, yet in the end they stay with God. And this is because the process has transformed them into servants. They have learned to love and serve God for who he is. This only happens to us during tough times. You'll see when the darkness dissipates, you will discover that the pressure has turned your heart, that lousy lump of coal, into a diamond. And then finally, excuse me, I'm sorry. I don't know why I get so dry up here. Talk to somebody about the humidifier or something. We have this fifth concept, waiting on God joyfully. Verse 4 is one of the most important verses in all of Scripture. It is quoted 3 times in the New Testament, and it says, the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. Most of us know it as the King James Version translates it, the just shall live by faith. But faith here is not stoically holding on to God. It is looking at our negative circumstances and relying on our faith in the redemptive purposes of God, that is, in the gospel itself. There is nothing that inspires joy in the darkest times than the reassurance of our redemption. In Luke chapter 12, Jesus tells a parable about a master who goes on a trip, leaving his servants in charge. Now, some of the servants don't believe the master's coming back, so they do whatever they want. But the ones who believe their master is returning are obedient and faithful. And then in verse 37, Jesus says, it will be good for those servants whose master finds them watching when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he will dress himself to serve, will have them recline at the table, and will come and wait on them. Now, just think about that. When Jesus returns, he promises to gather all of his followers together. He will dress himself to serve and personally wait on them. The word used here for dress himself to serve literally means to gird yourself. And at the time of Christ, if a man had to do something that was physically intense, He would take that long robe he was wearing and tuck the bottom of it into his belt so his legs would be free to move. That's girding yourself. This would allow him to run or to fight. But the phrase is also a metaphor for taking everything you have that might hinder you, lay it aside, and focus all of your energy on a single goal. And by using this phrase here, Jesus is saying that he is going to focus all of his energy on pouring out joy and honor and fulfillment and even happiness on us. The God of the universe will use the totality of his entire being and use it to bring us absolute, infinite, cosmic joy. So if you wait for him and wait on him for the rest of your life, when he returns at the end of time, he will literally wait on you. And we can be assured that God's going to do this because he's done it in the past. In John 13, on the night before he died, Jesus literally dressed himself to serve and washed his disciples' feet. Recall that Peter was shocked. What an undignified thing for the Messiah to do, to lower himself to the level of a mere table waiter. But Jesus was connecting this humble act of service to what he was about to do: go to the cross and sacrifice his life. In essence, Jesus was saying, I am going to wait on you by going to the cross and dying for your sin. Jesus Christ, the Lord of the universe, was willing to lay aside all of his celestial power, take the form of a lowly servant, and wait on us by going to the cross. He offered his service by sweating drops of blood, having the nails driven through his wrists, and literally facing the wrath of God while he hung on the cross for us. If we can see the reality that Jesus waited on us in his death and promises to wait on us in the future, there is great joy in committing ourselves to wait on him now. So if we can learn to wait on the Lord in these 5 ways, patiently, with proper perspective, obediently, focused on him, centered on him, and full of glory, I believe we can begin to find perfect freedom. Now, have I begun to find this freedom? If I'm really honest, I have to say, no. But I can really identify with the Habakkuk we see in chapter 1. He appears to be what every conscientious attorney strives to be: knowledgeable, articulate, concise, persuasive. And please note that everything he's upset about is absolutely true. He accurately describes all the wickedness, strife, and oppression that's around him, and he appeals to God to do something. But God does not act within the parameters of Habakkuk's expectations, which disappoints, perplexes, and angers him. This is like looking in a mirror for me. This has been my life pattern. I lay out my plans and expectations. I think to myself that it's reasonable to expect that what I'm planning to do is going to happen. And when those things don't happen, I get frustrated. And when that frustration continues as I try again or I alter my course, I become angry. When it's a recurring frustration, that anger can become very intense and very unreasonable, to the point of bitterness and repudiation. Like Habakkuk, I know what's true, I know how things are supposed to be, but my response to these disappointments, particularly as they pile up one on top of the other, is rage and despair. And that despair is also connected to another side of me. It has to do with my self-image and my perception of failure. Since I was a child, I have viewed almost any kind of negative outcome as being my fault. That's a very unhealthy version of assumed omniscience. It's like, I tried that, it's all messed up, but it's all because I'm just stupid. So every one of these disappointments sends me into a downward spiral that makes me into a person who is hard to get along with and who is of no use to anybody, let alone God. For example, last year, I went to this conference and I came back with all kinds of wonderful ideas to automate my practice, streamline my processes. I was going to be more productive and more efficient. I got new practice management software, but I couldn't make it work. I went through the training, I followed the tutorials, I even had one-on-one sessions with IT professionals to walk me through it as I asked them to do at a kindergarten level. But nothing worked. What was taking me a few hours with my old system or even doing the work manually was now taking me all freaking day. To simply reconcile my accounting was taking me hours and hours. What was supposed to save me time was stealing the time from me. I was frustrated beyond comprehension. And at each level of aggravation, the voices that I used to hear in my childhood would whisper, "See, this would all work if you just weren't so stupid." So I was not just collapsing under disappointment, but condemnation. I saw myself as trapped in a negative circumstances that would never change. I was losing hope. Now, of course, God was always urging me to wait on him for an answer, but I reacted in all the wrong ways. I did nothing to cultivate patience because I was sure that I knew better. I stayed down at the street level. I never climbed into the tower. I never got that perspective. And I ended up abandoning my post. I threw a tantrum, flipped God off, and withdrew into myself. No drugs, no alcohol, but I did eat a lot of comfort food and sought all kinds of other escape routes involving books and videos and my personal research projects. I nurtured my grudges against God, amplifying my past hurts and disappointments. I was a mess. But God, he's always faithful to me. Always. On a Sunday morning, not too very long ago, Pastor Brian encouraged all of us to ask God to speak to us directly. I closed my eyes and I listened, and I heard God say, "Trust me." So I purposed to make that choice. And in doing so, I opened up to others about my sense of feeling so damaged. I realized that I needed, even though I hadn't gone through this yet, I realized I needed to climb that tower to retake my post. I reinvigorated my devotional life and my openness with other people, and I wanted to get the right perspective and use that to approach my day-to-day frustrations, choose to count it all joy as or even before the frustrations began. And most of all, I have purpose to wait to hear what the Lord has to say about all this. Now, I can't claim a whole lot of victory. I struggle every day. But I can say that the Lord has helped to restore my hope in him. For even when I am willfully rejecting God because of my disappointments, he's always actively overcoming my obstinance with his love. And with that concept in mind, I'd like to close with a poem that a dear friend shared with me about these very issues. The poem itself was meant to address arguments regarding atheism, but it applies to my attitude and my experiences in spades. And the poem is called "Staying Power." Like the unbeliever, I sometimes follow my doubts outside to the yard and question the sky, longing to have the fight settled, thinking, I can't go on like this. And finally I say, all right, it is improbable. All right, there is no God. And then, as if I'm focusing a magnifying glass on dry leaves, God blazes up. It's the attention, maybe, to what isn't there that makes the emptiness flare like a forest fire until I have to spend the afternoon dragging the hose to put the smoldering thing out. And even on ordinary days, when a friend calls me and tells me they found melanoma and they complain that the hospital is cold, I say, God. God, I say, as my heart turns inside out. Pick up any language by the scruff of its neck, wipe its face, set it down on the lawn, and I bet it'll toddle right into the Godfire again, which, though they say it doesn't exist, can send you straight to the burn unit. Oh, we have only so many words to think with. Say God's not fire. Say anything. Say God's a telephone, maybe. You know, you didn't order that phone, but there it is. It rings. You don't know who it could be. You don't want to talk, so you pull out the plug. It rings. You smash it with a hammer till it bleeds, springs and coils and clobbery metal bits. it rings again. You pick it up, and a voice you love whispers, "Hello." Thank you for letting me share.